The sun over Veridian Prime rose slow and amber, the way it always did, filtered through a thin atmosphere that gave the sky a permanent golden haze, like the world itself was perpetually on the edge of sunset. The colonists had fallen in love with that sky. It was the first thing most of them mentioned when they sent messages back to Earth. You should see the mornings here. You really should. 2 million people called Veridian Prime home. They had come from every corner of Earth and every broken dream that Earth couldn't fix. Miners from collapsed industries in Eastern Europe, farmers from drought-scorched Australia, engineers tired of corporate cities, veterans who had seen enough of humanity's ugliness and wanted open land and clean air. They had carved a civilization out of a wild planet with their bare hands, their stubbornness, and an almost religious belief that if you worked hard enough, the land would give back. Governor Myra Solis was doing paperwork when the first alarm sounded. She didn't think much of it at first. Orbital sensors threw alerts occasionally, debris, rogue satellite drift, a freighter coming in off course. She kept her eyes on the resource allocation report in front of her until her communications officer, a young man named Davy, appeared in her doorway with a face the color of ash. "Governor," he said quietly, "it's ships, a lot of ships." The Cathara Dominion fleet materialized from FTL like a wound opening in space, 17 warships, each one the size of a small city, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in precise military formation. No hailing frequency, no diplomatic signal, no warning of any kind. They simply appeared, and then they started firing. The orbital defense grid, 3 aging but functional weapons platforms that the Colonial Council had argued about funding for 2 budget cycles, lasted 9 minutes. The Cathara ships dismantled them with the casual efficiency of someone swatting insects. Then they began their descent toward the planet's surface, assault landers detaching from the carrier hulls like dark seeds falling toward soil. In the capital, Solis stood at the emergency command window and watched the horizon light up as the first bombardment struck the Eastern Communication Relay Station. The explosion rolled across the plains like a slow wave, visible even from 40 kilometers away. Her hands were steady. She noticed that about herself and filed it away. Her defense chief, a retired Marine colonel named Haruto Vance, appeared at her shoulder. Vance was 63 years old, built like a piece of old machinery, worn down but completely functional. He had fought in 2 wars on Earth before deciding he was done with fighting. He had been on Veridian Prime for 11 years growing wheat and raising 2 dogs. "How bad?" Solis asked. "Orbital grid is gone. They've got landing parties inbound. Estimate 40,000 ground troops." He paused. "They're Cathara." Solis nodded slowly. The Cathara Dominion was not unknown to humanity. They were a conquering species, methodical, cold empire builders who had absorbed a dozen civilizations over 5 centuries. They negotiated from positions of total dominance and had never lost a ground campaign. Their reputation was the weapon they preferred most. The surrender demand came 20 minutes later, translated into flawless English by a Cathara AI system. It was polite, almost bureaucratic. Hand over administrative control, disarm all colonial militia, and civilian casualties would be kept to a minimum. The Dominion was claiming the Veridian system under expansion rights. Resistance was inadvisable. Solis looked at the message for a long time. Then she walked to the emergency broadcast console, opened every frequency available to the colony, civilian, military, agricultural, mining, and spoke to every single person on the planet simultaneously. "Veridian Prime," she said, her voice even and clear. "They just bombed our relay station and they're asking us to hand over our home. I'm going to send them our answer now. I want you to know that this is not the government's answer. This is ours, all of ours. Every farmer, every miner, every parent, every person who broke their back building this world from nothing." She leaned into the transmitter. "If you agree, go to your emergency stations, get your weapons, protect your neighbors." She clicked over to the Cathara command frequency. She transmitted 4 words. "Come and take it." In the mountains to the north, in the mining tunnels beneath the eastern plateau, in the farmhouses along the southern river valley, 2 million people heard their governor's voice, and 2 million people started moving. Not in panic, not in terror. In the grim, particular silence of people who had built something, and were not prepared to let it go. The Cathara landers touched down at dawn the following morning. Their commanders stepped out onto Veridian soil, fully expecting to begin processing a surrender. Instead, somewhere in the tree line 300 meters to the east, someone with a hunting rifle and 11 years of frontier experience settled their crosshairs and waited. The war had begun. The Cathara just didn't know yet what kind. The first Cathara patrol disappeared on the third day. 12 soldiers, full combat armor, standard sweep formation through the forest grid southeast of the capital. They had thermal imaging, motion sensors, and encrypted comms. They were some of the most well-equipped ground troops in the Dominion's military. They walked into the Viridian tree line at 600 and were never seen alive again. Their distress beacon activated at 7:43 and cut out 11 seconds later. Commander Vethal, the Cathara Ground Forces commander, reviewed the sensor data 4 times and still had no satisfactory explanation. There had been no energy weapon discharge, no explosive signature large enough to account for 12 casualties. Whatever had happened in that forest had happened quietly and quickly, which was somehow more unsettling than a direct firefight would have been. He sent another patrol to investigate. They found the equipment neatly stacked at the tree line, stripped of anything useful, with a single message scratched into the dirt in Cathara script, translated from a linguistic database the colonists had clearly pulled from somewhere. "This is our forest. The next patrol keeps nothing." Vethal stared at the translation for a long time. Colonel Haruto Vance had not intended to come out of retirement. He had genuinely meant it when he told people he was done with war. But there is a particular kind of person for whom retirement is a thing they do when nothing needs doing, and when something needs doing, the retirement simply ceases to apply. Within 6 hours of the invasion, he had converted his wheat barn into a tactical operations center, mapped every defensive advantage in a 200-kilometer radius, and organized the first 12 militia cells from memory and instinct. He knew things the Cathara did not. He knew that the mining tunnel network beneath the eastern plateau extended for over 400 kilometers, hand-dug, reinforced, lit with emergency phosphor strips, stocked with 3 months of emergency supplies by regulation and 6 months of supplies by frontier habit, because frontier people never trusted regulations enough to follow them exactly. He knew that the colonial emergency frequency was analog, not digital, making it nearly impossible to jam with standard military hardware. He knew that every adult on Viridian Prime had passed a mandatory survival and weapons certification, not because they were preparing for war, but because frontier life occasionally produced things that needed shooting. He turned all of this into a doctrine in 48 hours. Hit and vanish, never hold ground, make every kilometer of Viridian soil cost the Cathara something, make occupation feel like slow suffocation. The colonists took to it with startling effectiveness. A farmer named Bren Oscar, who had spent 20 years knowing every creek and rock formation on his land, led a 12-person cell that destroyed 3 Cathara resupply convoys in a single week using nothing but timing, terrain, and improvised explosives built from agricultural chemicals. A mining engineer named Petra Halloway discovered that certain tunnel vibrations could be triggered to collapse specific surface sections. She spent 2 weeks mapping which tunnels ran beneath Cathara patrol routes. A retired schoolteacher organized the colony's children into information runners, passing handwritten intelligence between cells in a system so low-tech it was invisible to the Dominion's signal interception systems. The Cathara were bewildered at a level that approached institutional crisis. Their entire military doctrine was built around a simple equation: superior firepower plus overwhelming numbers equals swift capitulation. It had worked on 11 species across 5 centuries. The equation assumed that the conquered people would, at some rational point, calculate the cost of continued resistance and choose survival over pride. The colonists appeared to have skipped that calculation entirely. By the end of the first month, Cathara casualty figures were 4 times projected estimates. Supply lines were being raided so consistently that forward units were going on half rations. 3 different Cathara officers had filed formal reports questioning the intelligence assessment that had classified humanity as a low-threat, pre-interstellar conflict species. One of those officers, a young tactical analyst named Chevra, wrote something in her private log that would later become famous when it was recovered and published. "I have studied 14 conquered species. None of them fought like this. The others fought for survival or ideology or desperation. These humans fight as if they are personally offended. As if our presence on their world is not merely a threat, but an insult they intend to make us regret at extraordinary personal cost to themselves. I do not know how to model an enemy whose primary motivation appears to be spite. Commander Vethal sent his first request for reinforcements on day 31, a communication he had been certain he would never need to send. He framed it carefully, professionally, with extensive supporting data. He did not include the part where he had begun having difficulty sleeping because of the absolute certainty that someone outside his command perimeter was watching him at all times. That felt unprofessional. But it was true. On Viridian Prime, in the tunnels and the forests and the farmhouses turned fortresses, the colonists maintained something that the Cathara had no strategic framework for. They maintained it in the face of losses that should have broken them. Friends killed, homes burned, food running low, children sleeping in tunnels. They maintained it the way people maintain things that are simply part of who they are, not a choice they have to keep making, but a fact of their character. They were not losing hope. They were not even close. They were waiting, and they were making the waiting cost the Cathara everything they had. His name was Tamaz Reyes, and he was 26 years old, and he was very possibly going to die in the next 10 minutes, and he was fine with that if the signal got through. Tamaz was not a soldier. He had been, 4 months ago, the third-shift communications technician for Viridian Prime Civilian Broadcast Authority, a job that mostly involved making sure agricultural weather reports transmitted clearly to the farming districts, and occasionally troubleshooting a satellite dish that the wind had knocked 3 degrees off alignment. He was good at his job in the quiet, competent way of someone who genuinely loved the machinery of communication. The idea that a signal could leave one point and arrive, intact and meaningful, at another point light years away. The Cathara jamming grid was thorough. Military-grade, multi-spectrum, designed to make the occupied colony invisible to the rest of the galaxy. It was, by any professional assessment, essentially impenetrable. Tamaz had been staring at it for 31 days. The problem with a multi-spectrum jamming field is that it has to cover a very large range of frequencies simultaneously. The solution to that engineering challenge is to use a distributed array, multiple jamming nodes working in coordination, handing off coverage responsibility in rotating cycles so no single node burns out. It was elegant and effective. It also meant that for approximately 0.3 seconds every 94 seconds, there was a microscopic gap in coverage as 2 nodes exchanged handoff timing. 0.3 seconds was not enough time to transmit a normal signal. It was, however, barely enough time to transmit a highly compressed, prepackaged burst. If the burst was prepared in advance, if the antenna was perfectly aimed, and if whoever was operating the system had the nerve to sit in a partially destroyed communications bunker with Cathara patrol drones overhead and wait for exactly the right moment. Tamaz had the nerve. The burst contained everything: sensor footage of the initial bombardment, casualty records, drone imagery of Cathara ground movements, Governor Solis' surrender refusal, 31 days of a civilian colony holding off a Dominion military force. He compressed it to 0.28 seconds of data and aimed it at a relay station 2.3 light-years away, which would bounce it to another relay, and another all the way to Earth. He hit the transmit key. The signal left Viridian Prime at the speed of light. Then a Cathara patrol drone detected the transmission spike, too late to stop it, but not too late to locate the source. Tamaz heard the alert tone, grabbed the backup drives, and ran. He made it to the tunnel entrance 40 seconds before the drone strike hit the bunker. He sat in the dark beneath the ground, breathing hard, drives clutched to his chest, and allowed himself exactly 30 seconds of relief. Then he got up and went to find Colonel Vance, because there was more work to do. The signal traveled for 17 days. It arrived at Earth at 3:14 in the morning, Greenwich time, at a deep space relay station staffed by 2 bored technicians who were in the middle of a card game. One of them noticed the emergency classification flag on the incoming burst, ran the decryption, watched the first 40 seconds of footage, and reached for the emergency escalation line without looking away from the screen. Within 20 minutes, the footage was in front of the director of United Earth Defense Command. Within 2 hours, it was in front of every head of state on Earth. What happened next was not panic. There were no screaming emergency sessions, no tearful speeches, no political paralysis. Those who expected Earth to fragment into debate and indecision had fundamentally misread what the footage would do to a species that had spent 10,000 years learning to respond to existential threats. What happened was silence, a very specific kind of silence. Admiral Una Park, commander of Earth's first expeditionary fleet, described it later in her memoir as the silence of a very large, very dangerous animal that had been struck across the face, and was deciding, with great calm, exactly how to respond. Contingency Myrmidon was activated at 600 hours the following morning. It was a war protocol so classified that most active-duty officers had never heard its name. It had been written 12 years earlier by a think tank of military historians, xenobiologists, and strategic planners who had asked a simple, uncomfortable question. What do we do if someone attacks us first, fast, and far from home? The answer they had built was thorough. Shipyards on Luna, Mars, and the orbital platforms above Earth went to continuous operation. Reserve fleets were recalled from every corner of human space. Weapons systems that had been in storage for years were dusted off, tested, and loaded. Supply chains reorganized overnight. Officers who had been quietly managing administrative roles found themselves handed command briefs and told to be ready in 30 days. The most striking thing, to those watching from the outside, the diplomats, the allied species observers, the Cathara intelligence assets who were only now beginning to realize what they had missed, was how quiet it all was. No dramatic speeches. No rallying cries broadcast across the galaxy. Just an entire civilization shifting gears with the smooth, practiced motion of something that had been ready for this, had hoped to never use the readiness, but had never once stopped maintaining it. On Veridian Prime, in the tunnels and the burned farmhouses, 2 million people were still fighting. They didn't know help was coming. They were acting as if it never would, because that was the only way to keep fighting, to make peace with the possibility that you might be alone in this and fight anyway. But 17 days away, moving at speeds the Cathara Dominion was about to find very surprising. Something enormous was coming. It had a name, stenciled on the hull of the lead carrier in letters 3 meters tall. UEDS Veridian Promise. They had named the flagship after the colony while it was still being assembled. That was the kind of species humanity was. There is a concept in Cathara military doctrine called Vethkai, roughly translated as the moment of rational surrender. Every conquered species had reached it. It was, in the Dominion's understanding, a biological imperative, the point at which a living creature, faced with overwhelming and unrelenting force, chose survival over continued futile resistance. It was not seen as cowardice. It was simply what rational beings did. 60 days into the occupation of Veridian Prime, Commander Vethal sat alone in his command vehicle and conducted a private assessment. He listed every indicator his doctrine said should have produced Vethkai weeks ago. Orbital superiority achieved. Civilian infrastructure damage significant. Food supply disruption severe. Communication grid destruction complete. Demonstrated military superiority in open engagement consistent. Theoretical Vethkai moment, day 12. Actual Vethkai moment had not occurred. Current human resistance level increasing. He closed the assessment document and stared at the wall of his command vehicle for a long time. The reports coming in from across the occupation zone were difficult to read, not because they were poorly written, but because they described things that had no precedent in the Dominion's military history. A cell of 11 colonists had ambushed a 40-soldier Cathara escort, destroyed 2 armored vehicles, and vanished into a tunnel system before the response drones arrived. The 11 colonists had not been professional soldiers. One had been a veterinarian. One had been a retired schoolteacher. The youngest was 19 years old. A Cathara forward supply depot, heavily guarded, surrounded by motion sensors, drone-patrolled, had been robbed, not destroyed. Robbed, food, medical supplies, and 3 cases of technical equipment had been removed with such precision that the sensors had detected nothing. A message had been left on the depot commander's personal data pad. Thanks for the supplies. We were running low. VP Militia Cell 7. The psychological impact on Cathara troops was becoming a measurable problem. Soldiers who were trained to fight a visible enemy were struggling with an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, that struck and vanished, that left mocking messages and stolen equipment rather than bodies, that seemed not merely unafraid of them but contemptuous. 3 Cathara squad leaders had filed medical reports citing sleep disorders. One had requested reassignment to a quieter sector and been told, gently, that there was no quiet sector. Colonel Vance, deep in the tunnel network, was running something he called a rotation of misery, deliberately shifting militia activity around the occupation zone on a schedule designed to ensure that no Cathara unit ever had more than 36 consecutive hours without an incident. Not because he had enough fighters to constantly engage, but because he had enough fighters to constantly remind the Cathara that they were not safe, that Viridian Prime was not subdued, that every moment of quiet was borrowed and paid for at interest. The psychological literature on occupation forces was something Vance had studied extensively during his military career. He knew the math. An occupying force that cannot achieve security eventually cannot function, not because of military defeat, but because of the grinding erosion of certainty that turns soldiers into anxious, exhausted, demoralized men who jump at shadows. He was making shadows. On day 63, a young Cathara soldier named Kelvas made a decision that would later become a footnote in the history of the conflict, but felt, at the time, utterly enormous. He was stationed at a checkpoint outside a small human settlement that the Cathara had been unable to fully secure because it sat at the entrance to 3 different tunnel access points. His orders were to hold the checkpoint and report activity. An old man had been bringing him food for 2 weeks, just showing up every morning with a container of something hot, setting it down, nodding, and walking away. Kelvas had eaten it every time because he was hungry, and because the gesture confused him too much to refuse it. On day 63, the old man sat down across from him and said, in careful, accent-heavy Cathara, learned from a translation program, clearly practiced for days, "You are not a bad person, but you are in a bad place. You should leave." Kelvas didn't know what to say. He filed the interaction in his personal log. 3 weeks later, his entire unit would be surrounded, disarmed, and released unharmed. The colonists taking their weapons and equipment, but not their lives, with a written note explaining, in formal language, that Viridian Prime did not consider itself at war with individual Cathara soldiers, only with the Dominion that sent them. Commander Vethal received the casualty and equipment loss reports from that incident, and did something none of his subordinates had ever seen him do. He put his head in his hands. Then he composed a second, more urgent request for reinforcements and added a personal note at the bottom. Outside normal protocol, unprofessional, but he included it anyway. "I must advise the High Council that the intelligence assessment which classified the human species as low threat requires immediate and comprehensive revision. These are not a primitive people making a futile stand. This is a civilization that has been at war with itself for millennia and has consequently become extraordinarily proficient at it. We have not conquered a colony. We have introduced ourselves to a species that does not forget introductions. Whatever decision the Council makes about reinforcements, I would strongly recommend it also include a plan for what we do if their fleet arrives before ours does." The High Council received the message and debated it for 6 days. They were still debating it when the Cathara sensor network at the edge of the Viridian system picked up an FTL signature, then another, then 17 more simultaneously. Then so many that the sensor array crashed trying to count them. The Cathara sensor operator who first saw the full scope of the incoming fleet would later say, in a deposition to the War Crimes Tribunal, that his first thought had not been fear. His first thought had been that the sensor array was malfunctioning. The number it was displaying was impossible. He ran 2 diagnostics before accepting that it was correct. 43 warships, 11 carrier groups, 22 troop transports, 8 electronic warfare vessels that were already, even from this distance, doing something to the Cathara communication arrays that made the technicians' boards flash red. And behind them, slightly apart from the military formation, 3 vessels of a type the Dominion's recognition database couldn't immediately classify, until someone thought to check the human-civilian registry. Press ships, broadcasting vessels, equipped with the most powerful long-range transmission arrays humanity had ever built. Admiral Unipark stood on the bridge of the UEDS Viridian Promise and looked at the tactical display showing the Cathara fleet positioning in defensive formation between her ships and the planet. She had been given one mandate by Earth's unified command, delivered in a single sentence with no elaboration: bring them home and make sure the galaxy watches. She had spent the 17-day transit doing 2 things simultaneously: running combat drills until her crew could execute battle maneuvers in their sleep, and working with the press contingent aboard the broadcast ships to build a real-time transmission package that would send everything, absolutely everything, to every receiving station in explored space. Because humanity had decided, at the highest levels and with remarkable unanimity, that this war would not be fought only on Veridian Prime. It would be fought in the court of galactic opinion, and it would be won there too. The evidence package had already been transmitted. Every member species of the Galactic Cooperative had received, in their own languages, a 340-page documented account of the Cathara attack, sensor data, casualty records, architectural surveys of destroyed colonial infrastructure, and a legal brief prepared by the War Crimes Division of United Earth Justice that outlined, in precise terms, every provision of the Galactic Cooperative's founding charter that the Dominion had violated. The Cathara had fired first on a civilian colony without provocation or declaration. Under galactic law, it was unambiguous. Under human law, it was personal. The space battle lasted 11 hours. It was ferocious, and it was not one-sided, and 4 human ships were destroyed and 2,314 people died, and their names were recorded and would be read aloud at a ceremony on Veridian Prime before the ink was dry on any peace agreement. Admiral Park had made that a condition of her command acceptance, that the names would be read, every one of them publicly before any celebration began. But the outcome was not in genuine doubt after the 3rd hour. Human naval doctrine, developed over centuries of conflict that the species had conducted enthusiastically against itself, was built on principles the Cathara had never needed to develop: adaptability, decentralized command, the ability of individual ship captains to make complex tactical decisions without waiting for orders. Cathara fleet doctrine was coordinated and powerful and almost completely dependent on their command hierarchy functioning. When the electronic warfare ships began systematically degrading that hierarchy, isolating command vessels, disrupting the coordination signals, the Cathara fleet began to fragment. Individual Cathara ships fought bravely. Several fought beautifully. But bravery in isolation against a coordinated force has a known outcome. By hour 11, the Cathara fleet was broken. 12 ships destroyed. 19 in retreat. 6 had submitted surrender signals, which Admiral Park accepted with formal military courtesy, immediately guaranteeing the safety of their crews. She then opened a channel to the colonial government on Veridian Prime, below. Governor Solis, broadcasting from a tunnel command center, her face lit by phosphor emergency lighting, her uniform the same one she'd been wearing for 2 months because her wardrobe was in a building that no longer existed, answered immediately. "Governor," Admiral Park said, "we're here." Mara Solis, who had not cried once in 60 days of invasion, who had signed casualty notifications and delivered condolences and made hard decisions and harder speeches, and had not allowed herself a single moment of visible grief because her people needed her steady, closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. "Took you long enough," she said. Her voice only broke a little. The Marines of the 3rd Expeditionary Division had trained for planetary assault in every conceivable environment. They had drilled in Arctic conditions, desert terrain, dense urban combat, zero-gravity boarding operations. They were among the best equipped and best trained ground forces humanity had ever fielded. When they landed on Veridian Prime and linked up with the colonial militia, the Marines discovered something that their training had not quite prepared them for. The colonists were better at this specific terrain than they were. Not better fighters necessarily. The Marines had more firepower, better armor, more advanced equipment, coordinated orbital support. But the colonists had something the Marines couldn't acquire in a briefing: 2 months of intimate, hard-earned knowledge of exactly how the Cathara operated in this specific environment, this specific terrain, against this specific civilian population. They knew which patrol routes the Cathara used at what times. They knew which commanders were cautious and which were aggressive. They knew the 3 locations where Cathara supply chains were thinnest. They knew the tunnel route that came up directly beneath the Eastern Occupation headquarters. Captain Dara Mensa, commanding officer of the 3rd Division's 1st Battalion, sat down with Bren Oscar, the farmer who had destroyed 3 supply convoys, and spent 4 hours learning everything the man knew. Then she gave him a tactical radio set and made him her forward scout. It was, by any formal military standard, wildly irregular. It worked better than anything she could have designed. The combined operations that followed were something that military historians would later analyze in considerable detail. The synthesis of professional military firepower and frontier irregular warfare, knowledge producing results that neither could have achieved alone. The Marines brought orbital strike coordination, advanced medical support, armored vehicles, and the ability to hold ground once it was taken. The colonists brought intimate terrain knowledge, established tunnel routes, existing intelligence networks, and a quality that Mensa struggled to define in her after-action reports before settling on the word ferocity, not bloodthirst, not recklessness, but the particular intensity of people fighting on ground they had personally built. The Cathara ground forces, already exhausted from 2 months of asymmetric warfare, were not prepared for the shift. They had adapted poorly to fighting an elusive irregular force. They were not ready for that irregular force to suddenly appear alongside professional military units with orbital support. The occupation zone collapsed in segments over 3 weeks. Eastern Plateau, Day 4. Southern River Valley, Day 9. The capital recapture was Day 14, a grinding block-by-block operation through streets that Solis had walked every morning for 11 years and now watched liberated building by building from a command position 2 kilometers back, because Vance had firmly, respectfully, and completely immovably refused to let her be closer. The final Cathara stronghold was a fortified compound in the northern mountain district, where Commander Vethal had gathered the remnants of his ground force, approximately 8,000 soldiers, heavily armed, in a position that could be taken by orbital strike in minutes. Vethal transmitted a request for negotiation rather than a surrender. He specified that he would speak with the colonial governor, not the military commander. Solis drove to the negotiation site herself. Vance came with her and 50 Marines and a War Crimes Tribunal observer, and because she had thought about this moment for 2 months and she was not going to miss the opportunity, Tamaz Reyes, the communications technician who had punched the signal through the jamming field. He didn't speak at the negotiation. He just stood in the room. She felt it was important that he be there. Vethal walked in and sat across from her. He was a large being, gray-skinned, formally postured even in defeat, with the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in command. He looked at her carefully, as if trying to understand something. "You held for 60 days, he said, with farmers and miners," Solis said, "and a retired schoolteacher and a 26-year-old comms technician." She nodded at Tamaz, who stared at the table. "Did you bring paper because I have terms?" They were not generous terms. They were precise, documented, and non-negotiable. Vethal read them carefully, asked 2 clarifying questions, and signed them. He was not a bad commander. He had done what his government told him to do. That was a separate conversation, and it was already being had at a level far above his rank. The Cathara High Council had spent the past 3 months in a state of managed crisis, which is what you call it when you refuse to admit it's a crisis. The early reports from Viridian Prime had been reframed. The reinforcement requests had been processed slowly. The intelligence failure, the catastrophic, inexcusable failure to correctly assess humanity as a species, had been quietly filed away in a drawer. The drawer was now on fire. Earth did not pursue the war in the way the Dominion expected. They had expected, based on historical precedent, that a human military victory at Viridian would result in a counter-invasion, fleets pushing into Cathara space, a war of territorial exchange. It was the pattern of every conflict the Dominion had experienced. Win or lose, the aftermath was the same shape. Humanity did something different. Instead of advancing militarily, Earth moved with surgical, diplomatic, and economic precision. A fleet of 16 warships was positioned at the 3 primary trade corridors that connected Cathara space to the broader galactic economy, not blocking them, simply present, transmitting their identification codes quietly and continuously. The message required no words. "We know where your supply lines are, and we want you to know we know." The full evidence package, every document, every sensor record, every piece of footage from the colony attack, was now being actively circulated in the chambers of every species that held membership in the Galactic Cooperative. Human diplomatic teams, quiet and professional and absolutely relentless, were meeting with every ambassador, every trade representative, every governmental observer, and asking a single question with polite persistence. "What does your charter mean, if an act like this has no consequence?" The Cathara had built their empire on being feared. Fear, it turned out, was a surprisingly fragile foundation when the feared party turned out not to be afraid of you. Several Dominion client species, smaller civilizations that had aligned with the Cathara not out of loyalty but out of pragmatic survival, were watching the situation with very careful attention. One of them, the Sari Collective, quietly opened a diplomatic channel to Earth. Then another. Then a third. The Dominion's political isolation happened not all at once, but in the grinding, inexorable way that real political shifts happen, gradually, then completely. Within the Cathara government itself, fracture lines were appearing that the leadership's very careful management of information had been suppressing. The military failure on Veridian Prime was known. The numbers couldn't be hidden from people who understood logistics. What was being managed was the interpretation of that failure. The Council's preferred interpretation was intelligence error, localized, correctable. What was spreading through the lower ranks of the military and civilian bureaucracy was a different interpretation. We picked the wrong enemy. Chevra, the young Cathara tactical analyst who had written that prescient private log entry about human spite, had been promoted twice in the chaos of the war's aftermath, partly because the officers above her had been implicated in the intelligence failures, and partly because she was clearly one of the only people who had seen clearly from the beginning. She was now briefing the High Council. Her briefing was 18 pages long. The summary on the first page was 3 sentences. The human species did not respond to the attack on Veridian Prime as an isolated incident requiring a localized response. They responded as if we had introduced ourselves to all of them simultaneously. They now know our name, our military capabilities, our strategic doctrine, our supply chain structure, and the location of every significant installation in our border systems. We know approximately as much about them as we did before the attack, which was not enough. The High Council voted to pursue formal peace negotiations on day 94 of the conflict. The vote was not unanimous. The councillors who voted against it were, within the following year, retired from their positions by political pressure from a Cathara public that had now seen the broadcast footage. The footage that had been transmitted to every species in explored space, and that Earth had made sure found its way to the Cathara people as well. Sovereignty over information was something the Dominion had maintained carefully for centuries. It discovered that this was significantly harder when the other party had better transmission technology and absolutely no interest in respecting your information borders. The Treaty of Veridian was signed on the 112th day of the conflict. They signed it on Veridian Prime itself. That was humanity's one non-negotiable demand about the process. Not on a neutral station. Not in a galactic diplomatic chamber. On the planet that had been attacked, in the Capitol building that had been partially destroyed and partially rebuilt in the weeks since liberation, in a room where you could still see, if you looked at the north wall carefully, the scorch mark from a Cathara drone strike that the repair crews had been told by Governor Solis to leave. The terms were recorded in full and transmitted simultaneously across all available frequencies. The Dominion issued a formal acknowledgement of the illegality of the attack. Reparations were set at a figure calculated by 3 independent economic assessors as covering full reconstruction plus 20 years of economic impact. The Cathara withdrew from all contested systems along the border. A war crimes tribunal was convened for the officers who had ordered the initial colony bombardment, the ones who had made the choice to fire on a civilian population without warning or declaration. The tribunal was conducted with the particular patient thoroughness of a legal system that had decided to do this correctly, not quickly. Each case was individual. Evidence was examined. Testimony was heard. It took 14 months to complete. Before any ceremony, before any speech, before any reception or formal dinner or diplomatic photograph, Admiral Park had held to this. The names were read. 2,314 people. The crew members of the 4 ships lost in the space battle. Read aloud each name by a different person, a colonist, a marine, a civilian technician, a nurse from the medical corps, a young comms officer. It took just over 3 hours. Every person present stood for all of it. No one sat down. When the last name was read, there was silence for 60 seconds. Then the ceremony continued. Veridian Prime's reconstruction moved quickly, partly because of the reparation funding, and partly because 2 million people who had spent months protecting their world were now extremely motivated to rebuild it. The farms went back in first. Bren Oscar replanted his fields within 2 weeks of the liberation. before the reconstruction crews had even finished surveying the damage. When someone asked him why he was in such a hurry, he shrugged and said the soil didn't know there'd been a war and it was rude to make it wait. Tamaz Reyes was offered a position with United Earth Defense Command's Communications Division, which would have come with a significant salary increase, a prestigious posting, and an apartment in one of the better districts of the lunar station. He thought about it for 3 days and then respectfully declined. He went back to his job at the Colonial Broadcast Authority. He had a satellite dish that needed recalibrating. Colonel Vance went back to his wheat farm. He rebuilt the barn that had been his tactical operations center, and once it was structurally sound again, planted a small memorial garden on the south side of it. Nothing formal, just some native Viridian flowers around a stone that listed the names of the 17 militia members from his cells who hadn't made it. He visited it every morning. Then he fed his dogs and got to work. Governor Mara Solis was re-elected to a third term with 91% of the vote, the highest margin in colonial election history. She gave an acceptance speech that lasted 4 minutes, which was unusually short for a victory address. She said that the credit belonged to the people who had fought, and the people who had held on, and the people who had transmitted distress signals through impossible jamming fields, and that her job was simply to be worthy of them. Then she got back to the paperwork. The Cathara diplomat who had signed the treaty, a senior official named Grevin who had spent the entire conflict in quiet opposition to the council's decisions, lingered after the formal proceedings. He found himself standing near Admiral Park on the steps of the rebuilt colonial government building, looking out over the capital, a city that was visibly scarred and visibly being stitched back together simultaneously. He had been trying to articulate something for weeks and finally decided to simply ask it directly. "What is it?" he said. "That makes your species fight the way you do? We have studied it. Our analysts have written thousands of pages. We still don't fully understand." Admiral Park considered the question for a moment. She was not a person who gave speeches. She was a person who gave answers. "We've been making war on each other for 10,000 years, she said. "We've survived ice ages, pandemics, famines, and several serious attempts to extinction ourselves. Every time something tried to end us, including ourselves, we were still here afterward. At some point that stops being luck and starts being character." She looked out at the city. "You didn't just attack a colony. You introduced yourself to all 2 billion of us at once. You showed us what you were willing to do." "We showed you what we're willing to do in return." She glanced at him. "The difference is we're willing to stop if the terms are right. The question you should be asking your council is whether you want us to stay stopped, or whether you want to keep finding out who we are." Grevin was quiet for a long moment. "I will convey that," he said. He left shortly after. His transport lifted off from Viridian Prime as the sun was setting, turning the sky the amber gold that the colonists had always loved, the color that made people send messages home saying you should see it, you really should. Below in the capital, the lights were coming back on building by building, street by street, the city reclaiming its own brightness. In the farms beyond the city limits, irrigation systems hummed back to life. In the mining tunnels beneath the eastern plateau, engineers were already surveying which sections were structurally sound and which needed reinforcing. In the Colonial Broadcast Office, a satellite dish rotated 3 degrees back into alignment. Somewhere in the shipyards above Viridian Prime, new colony vessels were in the early stages of construction, larger than the last generation, better equipped, designed for deeper frontier territory than any human settlement had reached before. Humanity was not pulling back. It was expanding,